Today, we are privileged to have Chris Lango, who has done video production and volunteer work at the Center for Sacramento History, producing and narrating a variety of projects. Each February is Black History Month, and his presentation examines the landmark legal battles in the 20-year fight for fair housing in Sacramento from 1948 to 1968, prohibiting discrimination based on religion, race, national origin, or sex. These civil rights cases impacted the nation and were argued by Nathaniel Colley Sr., the first African-American attorney in Sacramento to open the law practice. Chris's presentation will be told through the voice of Mr. Colley Sr. Take it away, Chris.
Thank you very much. Let me get my game together, as I want to thank Barbara Davis Lyman for offering me up, putting me in nomination. It's an honor to be here and to present this history to you. So my journey with this history began 12 years ago with this telegram. When I was doing that volunteer and video production work at the Center for Sacramento History, it was right when the Nathaniel Colley's family donated his papers to the center, and I just happened to almost accidentally come upon this telegram, and I was struck by the fact that the President of the United States sent this telegram to somebody named Nathaniel Colley, whose office was right around the corner from where I lived, urgently calling him to the White House during the summer of 1963, and I had never heard the name Nathaniel Colley, didn't know anything about him. And so that started me on this journey that led to the production, first of all, of 3 films for the Center for Sacramento History. The first one was on Nathaniel Colley, his career as a civil rights attorney. The second was about Sacramento's redevelopment history. And then the third in the trilogy, Desegregating Sacramento, A Fight for Fair Housing. This is the one we're talking about today. This just finished, and it is part 1 of what's going to be a 2-part series. This part focuses on the early civil rights victories that were won by Nathaniel Colley in housing discrimination, where the federal government was involved in public housing and then also in private housing that was insured by the federal government. So before we begin, watch the film, which is 15 minutes. And then after the film, I will walk through the private housing struggle that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. I just want to thank everybody at the Center for Sacramento History, everybody who's worked there for the last 12 years on these projects with me. They are all owned by the center, and it's been eye-opening to work on these 3 films over the years. Also want to thank Sacramento State, the Sacramento Public Library, the Sacramento Room, the California State Library, Steve Davis Productions for all the video and audio work on these projects, and the Nathaniel Colley Civil Rights Coalition, most especially with this film, Dr. Jesus Hernandez and historian Clarence Caesar, who were both interviewed for this film. So with that, let's begin with this. It's about 14-minute film, Desegregating Sacramento, A Fight for Fair Housing, What We Didn't Learn in School.
Chris, I'm going to have you turn off your video lights on. I'm going to have you turn off your video lights on. And close that dialog box.
Wait a minute, I need to go back somehow. I need to go back to the previous. Okay, you need me to do what now?
I'm sorry. We didn't talk about having your video off during the video while you're playing your 15-minute slideshow, because I think having you up there in the video will distract from that. So
okay, so I need to
just on the Zoom, just hit the turn off video on the bottom left corner, in your bottom left corner. There you go, perfect. And then close that dialog box again up in the top with the 3 dots. And hide the floating controls, perfect. Great, sorry folks, we didn't practice this part.
Sorry about that.
No worries, you're good, go ahead.
It is neither proper nor equitable that Americans should be denied the benefits of housing owned by the federal government or financed through the federal assistance on the basis of their race, color, creed, or national origin.
First, we're going to have to lay the facts on the line about the existence of discrimination in housing. We're going to have to educate the public to the fact that it is an existing thing which is a real problem.
It is clearly against the law to segregate people in these projects, yet there are many projects which are still segregated. Even in Sacramento, California,
Our speaker at this session, Mr. Nathaniel Colley, is a well-known attorney in our community. Besides his general law practice in Sacramento, he has been the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's Council in Sacramento and San Francisco public housing cases. I regard it a distinct honor and privilege to present Mr. Colley to you.
today I'm to discuss with you the subject of desegregation in housing. You might be surprised to know that the federal government has facilitated segregation in housing in this country. In fact, the federal government can be accused of actually causing it. These are harsh charges, but these charges are true.
Part of the reason this history is important is because the inequalities that we see today have a long history. Starting in the 1920s, for instance, when California's population really began to grow, we find that the more people that came here of different ethnicities in greater numbers, the more temptation there was to discriminate against those groups if there were preconceived prejudices against them. So we begin to see things like restrictive covenants and housing deeds.
It was a big part of the National Association of Real Estate Boards across the United States. And they were very instrumental in guiding local real estate branches across the country on how to use race covenants to preserve the value of their properties.
And these covenants usually provided that at no time should the land be used, occupied, or owned by any person except persons of the Caucasian race. And builders and subdividers could exclude entire ethnic groups from whole neighborhoods by placing restrictive covenants on the land.
There was actually a hierarchy of ethnicities that they wanted, that they preferred for those neighborhoods, and others that they didn't. And sometimes these hierarchies were listed in order from Western Europeans all the way down to Negroes and Mexicans as the language put back in those days.
Now, as they do this and they promote this exclusionary type of housing, they also become the administrators for FHA. And this is how we got race covenants as a condition of FHA financing. And this notion of relating race to value also was prominent in the way we decided who got to live in public housing. So you see all this public housing going across the United States. And similarly, you will see this process of segregation around the housing developments and sometimes within the housing developments. But the big problem here is that when you use government funds, public funds, to create housing, it's supposed to provide equal access.
Well, New Helvetia was a housing project that was built in 1941, Sacramento's first public housing project. And as time went along and more people moved into the 310 some odd units that were there, certain practices began to take place that reflected discriminatory practices by the Sacramento Housing Authority. They had 16 black households that were segregated in one section apart from the white households. This went on for a number of years until it was discovered by Nathaniel Colley. He went back and talked to local members of the NAACP, and so they determined that what they would do was take a few of those black tenants and get them to be part of a lawsuit against the Sacramento Housing Authority. So on February 1st, 1952, Superior Court Judge J.L. Henry determined that the Sacramento Housing Authority was in violation of anti-discriminatory laws that were on the books at that time. And that case that Colley got the injunction for was actually the first of its kind involving public housing in the entire United States as far as we know. And it was believed that the Housing Authority would, in good faith, honor that injunction. And of course, Colley years later stated that, in his opinion, discrimination in New Helvetia was still ongoing.
Where there is an injunction against the Sacramento Housing Authority prohibiting them from segregating, you will find that the vast majority of the Negro people live in one little geographical area. And you will also find that the few Caucasians in between are usually of Mexican ancestry. Well, the truth of the matter is we didn't have any objection to living next to people of Mexican ancestry. We were simply trying to point out that while they were complying with the letter of the law, certainly they were not complying with the spirit of it. And in my judgment, they have still not complied.
Hello? Won't you join us for a trip depicting life in Sacramento, 1950? And of course, a growing community means more homes, more places to live, more people buying a little bit of earth and a house to go on it, to call all their own.
Well, the work that Colley did in terms of public housing also had a counterpart in the private housing sector that needed to be resolved.
The most important phase of housing at this time is that insured by the FHA or the Veterans Administration. This group of housing constitutes over 90% of all the new housing constructed in this country since 1940. Well, what has been the record in that housing?
For these projects, they were being sold to white veterans and to white homeowners or prospective buyers, but not to blacks, who were also veterans and who were also home buyers.
And so this leaves us this predicament of a growing Sacramento where we're actually have 3 military sites, and they're using, by law, minority labor in these places. So now you're seeing the rise of a new middle class that's able to afford places like Arden Park Country Club, Town and Country Village, all these places coming up where they can live in just about any place because they have the income to do it.
So Nathaniel Colley ran across a case where African-American gentleman by the name of Oliver Ming, an employee of McClellan Air Force Base, wanted to buy a house in a subdivision that was being built near the North Highlands area, which is, of course, in the northern part of Sacramento County. And he went to the actual site to try to negotiate the thought of buying a home out there and was told, no, we do not sell to black people, literally, in his face.
Many Americans are amazed to know that up until the year of our Lord 1950, our great federal government required, mark my word, I did not say permitted, I said the federal government required restrictive covenants on land insured by FHA.
So now these builders become the proxy for the federal government to refuse housing to people who can actually afford it, just on the basis of color. So the intent here was to actually keep our new neighborhoods segregated.
Of course, the theory behind fair housing is that nobody is to be discriminated against. All fair housing does is try to make housing available to all people without regard to race, color, or creed. It seems to me this is fundamental in the American system, but somehow we have not been able to sell that idea to people.
So we've got over 10,000 new homes in Land Park and Arden Park and all these new places in between. And so we're over 10,000, but we don't have one person of color living in any of them. They had to go outside of these boundaries, outside of these racially exclusive boundaries to buy their home. This is how we see Glen Elder pop up in the middle of nowhere, because it was the formation of a separate but equal type of residential development here. And, you know, without the infrastructure and buses and things of this sort and gutters and things of this, we're building new homes out there. This is the only place where a minority can use an FHA loan. Now we have this situation where there's an inequity. We've already shown in the New Helvetia case that you cannot discriminate with federal funds. But here we're doing the exact thing that New Helvetia case fought for. So the Ming case really drives home this flaw in public policy that Colley is exposing to people.
During his closing arguments, Colley approached the judge and made sure that he heard and understood the importance and gravity of what this particular decision would mean. And that quote states, "One who dips his hand into the pocket of the federal treasury must not complain if a little democracy clings to it." But Oliver Ming was the first case that we know of that spoke to this idea that any federal funds being used for private housing acquisition could not discriminate on the basis of race.
Ming wins this case, and they award him $1 in damages. $1 in damages. You know, this is a guy who was all over town trying to find a house he can move into, and he's awarded $1 for all of his injury, which, you know, is basically a slap in the face to this whole process, this legal process that Colley was rolling out for us.
And the FHA is just getting around to being goaded into trying to assist in making this housing available to all without regard to race, color, or creed.
I have today signed an executive order directing federal departments and agencies to take every proper and legal action to prevent discrimination in the sale or lease of housing facilities owned or operated by the federal government, housing constructed or sold as a result of loans or grants to be made by the federal government, or by loans to be insured or guaranteed by the federal government. I have directed the housing agency and other appropriate agencies to use their good offices to promote and encourage the abandonment of discriminatory practices that may now exist.
In conclusion, let me say that it is my opinion that housing segregation is the key to the entire fight for desegregation in America. Until we desegregate housing, all of our other efforts will be of limited consequence.
And so when we try to sum all of this up, what Nathaniel Colley is trying to say here is how housing has this major impact on all of our lives, because where we live is our first exposure to all the things that make us productive in society. Our education, our employment, the churches we go to, the recreation we have around us, what people call the social determinants of health, comes from where we live. And so when neighborhoods are deficient, when they don't have parks, when they don't have schools and STEM programs, when they don't have healthcare and hospitals, people suffer. This actually impacts their ability to earn income. When our income is affected, where we live also becomes affected, so that you can see these patterns of discrimination that happened years ago actually impact the future. And so even though Colley was clear that you can't use these government benefits to promote segregation, it did not get rid of other issues that were still at the forefront in the fight for fair housing during that time. You know, it did not get rid of redlining. Lenders could still redline on the basis of race. It did not get rid of the use of color in the appraisal process. So we still see this rampant discrimination across the city.
Isn't the NAACP also finding fault with housing practices within California?
Yes, there's widespread evidence in this regard, and when the lawsuit comes, I think people will see that the state agencies have much power to do something about housing discrimination, but they have done nothing about it.
How long do you expect this legal battle to take?
Well, I don't know, but as some general said, once we're prepared to fight on this line all winter, but we're prepared to fight on this line for many years if it takes that.
Okay, are we back?
Yeah, you're just gonna advance to the next slide.
Okay.
Right there to the left should be a little arrow there. There it is.
So thank you very much. That takes care of government-backed segregation in housing. But what about the private housing? What was it like to look for a home if you were a minority during this period in history? Well, this is Marian Uchida, and she describes what it was like to look for a house after being displaced from Japantown, which is where Capitol Mall is. She's followed by Blanche Hill, an African-American woman who lived near the Crocker Art Gallery, and when she went to look for a home after being displaced during redevelopment.
The one thing I remember when we had to look for a new house is that I worked at McClellan Air Force Base and I worked the swing shift. So in the morning, my father would have me look through the Sacramento Bee and the Sacramento Union to see what homes were for sale. And I would call in the morning. And naturally, after a while, you get this feeling that, they don't want to sell to you. I don't care if the home is for sale. And all of a sudden, oh, no, we have a buyer. We have a pending buyer, blah, blah, blah. And they give you this song and dance. So after a while, I got to the point where I would say, hey, we're Japanese. If you don't want to sell to us, don't waste my time. Just tell me right now. And then, goodbye or whatever,
I'm part of the influx of blacks from the West End during the when 3rd Street was and the West End was redeveloped. And of course, if you look for a house, you were told that there was no place they could put you except Oak Park. So quite a number of us were geared toward Oak Park because we wanted a decent place to live. Oak Park was a beautiful place at that time, and people were moved in here overnight. There was an effort to block bust, and with all this fear, the blacks, the whites moved out. People who had beautiful backyards with roses, who had fruits, they had built those, planted the yards and gardens for a lifetime, and they were frightened and they sold the property and they got out of here.
So it became clear that some sort of open, fair housing law was needed, and the California legislature took the forefront or the lead in this, and the NAACP very much was an advocate for this. The bill itself that was put forth in the California Assembly was sponsored by Byron Rumford on your right, the first African-American member of the legislature from Northern California. And at the end of June in 1963, after a very contentious debate, the legislature passed the Rumford Fair Housing Act, opening up all private housing and banning racial discrimination. These are some of the folks that worked on that effort. There's Mr. Rumford there in the center, and there's Nathaniel Colley right behind him. But those smiles lasted only 1 year. That's because the real estate industry was very much opposed to open and fair housing. And so they sponsored an initiative on the ballot called Proposition 14. And they got enough signatures to put it on the ballot. And Proposition 14 advocated for the overturn of the Rumford Fair Housing Act. As they put it here, restore your freedom to sell or rent your residential property to anyone you choose. The No on 14 campaign, all about keeping open housing, they tried to paint it as a moral issue. Let every citizen of California ask himself if he has the moral right to deny equal opportunity to anyone. Well, how did that turn out? Well, it was a landslide. In the November 1964 election, the voters of California overturned the fair housing law by passing Proposition 14 by a 2-to-1 margin. So in this case, you had the government actually advocating for fair housing, and you had the citizens of California saying, no, we're not there yet. So what was it like if you were African American at that time when 1 year earlier open housing was passed, and now less than a year later it was repealed? Clarence Caesar, who we saw in the film, was just a teenager when that happens, and he remembers that day.
When Prop 14 was passed, I was 14 years old. And everybody in the black community, my age group, even younger people, understood what that meant, because we all understood what fair housing meant in our communities. Because I was raised in Del Paso Heights. I could see the conditions in Del Paso Heights. We were a working class community, but for those that wanted to move into more of the middle class or whatever, they saw that as Prop 14 as a killer to those dreams, because they understood that if this remained the law of the land, then maybe we'd be stuck in Del Paso Heights or Oak Park or whatever communities we lived in.
So it was game on for Nathaniel Colley. He had successfully argued for the desegregation of public housing and private housing that was backed by the government, and now it was time to take on all housing. So this is Nathaniel Colley's reaction the day after Prop 14 passed, also followed by the reaction of Ken Stewart, who was with the Sacramento Real Estate Board. Again, this is the day after the election in 1964.
Until Proposition 14 is declared unconstitutional, I think you'll see a return of the ads in the newspapers, restricted or unrestricted, and this has always meant Negroes and others allowed or not. We will see a return of the exclusive neighborhoods where people will be excluded on the basis of race or color.
It's very gratifying in anything of this character where the issue is so controversial that there would be such a margin of difference in the votes, because it constitutes what we think is a clear mandate of how the population of this state feels. And we also feel as though in this, our local board and our state association, we're actually representing the majority of the people.
The NAACP, whom I represent, is preparing at this present time a suit to be filed in the state Supreme Court directing the Secretary of State and the state printer not to take any action to include Proposition 14 as a part of the state constitution.
Where will it go from there?
Well, this particular suit, we hope, will not have to go anywhere from there. We hope we begin and end in the state Supreme Court with a favorable decision on our behalf.
And so Nathaniel Colley did, in fact, file that first case to test the constitutionality of Prop 14 right here in Sacramento. And that case involved a white landlord named Crawford Miller, who was very much in favor of integrated housing. He evicted a black tenant named Clifton Hill because Prop 14 said he could do it. So this was the test case. And guess what? In Sacramento, the judge ruled in favor of Crawford Miller, the white landlord. Says, you're right, you can evict him because Prop 14 says you can evict him for any reason, including race. So, of course, Nathaniel Colley immediately appealed that ruling to the California State Supreme Court. And during this whole process, that case was combined with 6 other cases from around the state. And finally, in 1966, just a few weeks before Nathaniel Colley was going to argue the final arguments in this case before the state Supreme Court, you can see in this clip how antsy he was and eager he was to get at it.
Supreme Court didn't go ahead and rule 14 unconstitutional right now?
Well, naturally, I'm impatient, but I don't make these decisions. I find myself always impatient with judges, impatient with juries. But see, I don't make these decisions. I just urge other people to do so.
Are you ready to argue again then in March?
I could argue it this afternoon. I know it like I know my alphabet.
What do you think the state Supreme Court is going to do after these arguments in March?
I can't say anything except that I hope they would hurry up and make a decision. But I don't know what that decision will be. I know what it ought to be, and I don't know how long it will take the court to make the decision.
What do you think chances are that they'll make the decision you think ought to be made?
I've always thought that the chances of that were very, very good. I've never felt as confident about a lawsuit in all my life as I feel about this one.
So on May 10th, 1966, the California Supreme Court agreed with Nathaniel Colley by a 5-2 vote, ruled that Proposition 14 was unconstitutional, restoring the state's Fair Housing Act. But of course, the real estate industry, they didn't like that, so they appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court took the case. Here's here's the list of attorneys. This is December 5th, 1966, the day the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. And there you can see the 5 attorneys that argued for fair housing: Herm Selvin, A.L. Weirin, Fred Ocran, Joseph Ball, and Nathaniel Colley. The first 4 were all ACLU attorneys from Los Angeles. Nathaniel Colley was the only African American on the brief and the only attorney from Northern California. And so in May of 1967, 6 months later, the High Court rules in favor of Colley's side, making fair housing the law of the land. Prop 14 is illegal. And so the following year, 1968, Lyndon Johnson signs the Fair Housing Act, and Nathaniel Colley is hailed as Mr. Civil Rights of California. There was a testimonial dinner in his honor right here in Sacramento, and 4 Supreme Court justices sent telegrams to this testimonial dinner. And one of them was Earl Warren himself, the Chief Justice, who referred to Colley as a champion of justice. And here's a photo from that event. There's Byron Rumford, the author of the Fair Housing Bill, standing next to Colley. Claude Hudson from the NAACP, whom he's shaking hands with. And there's Mervyn Dimely, the highest elected Black official in the state of California. He became Jerry Brown's lieutenant governor in the 1970s. He's the one who actually hailed Nathaniel Colley as Mr. Civil Rights of California. Now, along this journey, there were some very interesting developments that really were nation-changing and world-changing. One of them, after Prop 14 was passed in 1964, the federal government cut off all urban renewal funds to cities across California because they argued, you are now in the business of sanctioning segregation. And so this impacted cities up and down the state, including Sacramento. The downtown plaza was a victim of this backlash, if you will. Sacramento was on a redevelopment roll in the early 60s, and this Prop 14 put a screeching halt to the downtown plaza until Nathaniel Colley argued before the state Supreme Court. And once the state Supreme Court overturned Proposition 14, then the urban renewal work all across the state was allowed to continue. Another fascinating element to this issue of Proposition 14 and open housing and segregation in housing was the Atomic Energy Commission was offering up the world's largest atom smasher. And Sacramento was a finalist in this race to be the site. It was a $375 million project, the largest in the world, but it came with one caveat. The Atomic Energy Commission demanded open housing in the city that it picked. And so this was a major issue that paralleled the fight for fair housing here in California. In fact, on this day, on March 22nd, 1966, the same day that Nathaniel Colley argued against Prop 14 before the state Supreme Court, this was the front page of the Sacramento Bee. You see the headline, Capitol remains an atom smasher race. But down here on the left, High Court hears final arguments on Prop 14. Here's another one where the two stories are literally side by side. This was the day that Prop 14 was appealed to the US Supreme Court. Rights record, a factor in atom smasher site. That's the civil rights record. And so, you know what happens? Sacramento loses out in the race for the atom smasher. And while this housing issue may not have been the absolute determining factor in Sacramento not getting the project, it was clearly part of the decision. Here's a quote from Sacramento's own Congressman, John Moss. I think Sacramento needed a little more evidence of willingness to cooperate in the matter of integrated housing. So you can see that this housing thing wasn't just, confined to fairness and where people can live or can't live, inclusion versus exclusion. This really impacted everything, including the 1966 governor's race. This was a world changer between Pat Brown and Ronald Reagan. The key issue in this race was housing. By this time, the state Supreme Court had already ruled Prop 14 unconstitutional, but this was still a major issue in the gubernatorial race of 1966. Pat Brown was very much in favor of open housing. Ronald Reagan was the chief spokesperson for the Prop 14 crowd. He was the chief spokesperson for non-open housing. And it became so contentious that during the gubernatorial race, each of these two candidates accused the other of living in homes or renting homes that had restrictive covenants on them.
Ronald Reagan has been charged with renting some property, or actually, no, from selling some property down in Southern California back in 1941. The report is that he owned it, and that there was something about he didn't want to rent to anyone other than white people, or he was not allowing some colored people in there. And he has said that this is new to him, he doesn't understand it, and one of the reasons was because he doesn't understand the legal jargon in a deed. Would you comment on that?
Well, the only thing is, you'll recall that on Meet the Press on Sunday, he made a statement that he had been against restrictive covenants all the days of his life. Now, he used that term himself. It wasn't, maybe it was given to him, I don't know. But the fact is that he did sign and initiate a restrictive covenant. That's the whole gist of the thing. If he hadn't brought it up himself, why, I don't think the Democratic state chairman would have said anything about him. But he was trying to explain his position, and I don't think that he did it very well.
I didn't know until yesterday when they told me about this, that such a thing was in the deed. First of all, I'd never read it. I signed where my friend, the real estate man, told me to sign, and bought a lot. So yesterday I discovered this. Of course, now that doesn't count. They're no longer legal. But curiously enough, to show you how widespread and common that might have been, the governor is presently living in a home on Muirfield Road in Los Angeles that has such a restrictive covenant.
So how did that debate turn out? Well, we all know what happened. Ronald Reagan handily defeated Pat Brown in the election 5 weeks after those comments were made, and went on to become California governor for 8 years, and then took a little break and went on to become president. And while he was president, he nominated Sacramento's own Anthony Kennedy to the Supreme Court. And in the confirmation process, Nathaniel Colley was asked to testify on Justice Kennedy's behalf. And so I'm going to end with this clip. This is a little back and forth between Nathaniel Colley and the chair at that time of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who just happens to be the current president of the United States.
Well, first I went to Tuskegee in Alabama, but I went to Yale, but I went there because Stanford didn't welcome black people then. Columbia had a quota, and Harvard was too far from Harlem, so I went to Yale. But I want to say further that...
And if I'm not mistaken, you graduated with distinction from Yale.
Well, yes, that's because I want you to know that I'm not from the establishment. Everybody's been asking about the establishment.
You sounded like it, though.
No, I did not. I'm not a part of the establishment. I was born in rural Alabama, and I represent, I think, something special in America, and that is you can come from anywhere and go anywhere if you really try. And I came from rural Alabama, where I was unfit for picking cotton from the very outset. My mother recognized this, and she encouraged me to read books. And of course, that was very important in my life, because I ended up as an officer in the Army, for instance. You will never know how much trouble it gave me to lead a black company in the Solomon Islands and in the Philippine Islands and in New Guinea, and people would ask me, why are all the people in your company black? And I also recognized the segregations and the evils of it. And I determined at that time that something had to be done about this. And so I made the bold move of deciding to go to law school.
So that bold move of deciding to go to law school was based on the discrimination that he witnessed in World War II. And when he was a captain in the Army in the war, he actually developed a protective suit. He was a chemist, and he developed a suit to protect soldiers from mustard gas, for which he received a presidential citation from Harry Truman. And when he came back to the United States after the war, came back to Alabama and wanted to attend law school. The University of Alabama would not welcome him because of his race, obviously. And so the state of Alabama paid for his education at Yale. So with that, I will wrap it up and we'll be more than happy to answer any questions.
Well, first of all, thank you for that very, very interesting insight. And just speaking for myself, much of it is new information for me, as well as new information, I suspect, for any number of our attendees. A few questions. And it's in part to the process that you went through. You said that the trigger for this was the telegram from then President Kennedy to Nathaniel Colley. How long did it take you to put together your video in terms of finding the documents? And related to that is, how did you locate the people whom you interviewed and included in today's presentation?
Well, just to answer that part of the question first, I didn't just like all of a sudden 3 months ago look in the phone book and find, oh, let's talk to them. This whole process of finding the documents and the footage and people to talk to has been a cumulative effort that's lasted 12 years now. And so from the moment that I saw that telegram, that led to basically producing a short video to celebrate the gift of the Nathaniel Colley papers at the Center for Sacramento History. And that was in March of 2012, so coming up on 10 years. And during that celebration, I got to meet some of the people that, like Clarence Caesar, for example. I mean, I got to meet people that I would later interview over and over again. I've interviewed Clarence, for example, 3 times for each one of these films. And so the Center for Sacramento History has been very helpful in this regard too, because they know people in town. For the documentary I did on the history of Sacramento redevelopment, we interviewed 5 Japanese Americans who lived on where Capitol Mall is now. And that was a combination. That was Kevin Wildy, who wrote a book on Japantown, was very helpful in talking to people. And so it's just a cumulative effort over the years of meeting people. And also, when it comes to finding the documents, the key to this is, and this is a big thanks to the Colley family, they donated their father's papers to the Center for Sacramento History. And so I've become quite familiar with them over the years. And so finding the documents, that's pretty much been the epicenter of it. And then also another key to the way I like to tell stories is through newspapers, real time, as these events are unfolding and happening, where we don't know how they're going to turn out. And so finding headlines, in the film at the beginning, this subdivision that was built exclusively for, the language of the day, Negroes only. That was a very small article on page 21 of the Sacramento Bee that day at the bottom. But the language in that article was something that you would see out of like Selma, Alabama, not something out of Sacramento, So there's a lot of digging. It's a combination of definitely being patient and persistent. So that was kind of a long answer.
Well, but very interesting. So another question we had, obviously Nathaniel Colley worked greatly through the legal process, whether it was through NAACP, response to Prop 14, et cetera. Did he also engage, I'm trying to reflect one of the questions that was posted, engage in community activism in terms of organizing groups or that sort of route in terms of community response in addition to litigation?
Yes, he did. I wouldn't necessarily describe him as, he wasn't a preacher, for instance, or, he wasn't necessarily out, being an overt activist, as much as, you might say other national figures, because he was a legal intellectual along the lines of the Thurgood Marshall. But he was very active in Sacramento and nationally. And when it was appropriate, he definitely spoke out. In fact, in 1989, when the U.S. Supreme Court had 3 cases come before it that all were really detrimental to civil rights, he went to the steps of the U.S. Capitol and spoke out against it. And one of the people he was speaking out against on the high court was the one he endorsed, in Anthony Kennedy. Also, he was a very successful private practicing attorney who represented everybody from all different walks of life. And, he didn't discriminate against anybody. And he was also a really fun person and a funny guy, and was well liked throughout the community. And that's been a challenge during this journey, to try to present that side of him, because the struggles that he was involved in were so serious, in terms of the civil rights. But he was an activist. I think, his activism was most noted, however, in the courtroom, because he was an absolutely brilliant trial attorney. Pete Wilson called him the finest trial attorney in the state of California. And, it was widely known that if you were going up against him, you better have your game together. And if you couldn't, and, later in his career, when he just kind of, he was in such demand that he didn't necessarily know all the minutia of every case. And so if you were on the opposite side of him in a courtroom, if you didn't get him the first 2 days, you were done. Because if he got a 3rd or 4th day, he would take you to the cleaners.
So again, combining several questions from our audience, it's a 2-part question. What is your next project? And then someone also asked whether they had heard correctly, you're doing another project in this same area, whether fair housing or desegregation in Sacramento, et cetera. So if you could, tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So the next the next video in this series, which is really my next project, if you will, involves these other forms of discrimination. So part of the second part will be this history that I just presented, this Proposition 14 going up to the Supreme Court. But there's also redlining, banks and public institutions not loaning money in certain areas based on the race of people that lived in those areas. And so you have blockbusting, you have steering, where realtors would steer African Americans to certain neighborhoods, wouldn't show them homes in certain neighborhoods, and other minorities as well. So there's all of these other forms of discrimination that have continued on, much more, you might say, subtle or sophisticated, because there's so many that were intent on keeping our neighborhoods segregated as much as possible. And also the Fair Housing Act, when it was signed into law, didn't have the teeth, the real backing that it needed. And so that's why over the years, it's had to be constantly, looked at and amended and cleaned up what didn't address originally. So the second half of this series is going to address a lot of this unfair housing that continued on in the long struggle. the other project that I'm finishing up is a residence memories series regarding people that used to live at the New Helvetia and CV Circle housing projects. As we say in the film, New Helvetia is a very historic place because that was the site of the first segregation lawsuit filed in Sacramento. And so the Nathaniel Colley Commission, the Nathaniel Colley Coalition, who I'm doing some work for, I'm doing this series of residents that used to live at New Helvetia and what it was like for them during their years there, so that we have it for the history books and for the coalition. So that series will be completed shortly as well.
Well, perhaps tip us off when that's ready, because you have a very interested group of people tuned in today.
Well, all right.
So another question, which may be a little bit of far afield of what you were researching. What about a code of ethics for realtors in terms of them not engaging in discrimination, or was there no such thing at that time, or just easily ignored, if you know?
The code, well, back 100 years ago, the code of ethics for the National Association of Real Estate Boards was to keep our neighborhoods segregated. And it was written, it was Article 34. And you don't want to introduce into any of these new developments that realtors were building anybody who wasn't Caucasian. And so this was written into the code. And as we try to explain in the film a little bit, when during the Depression, when Franklin Roosevelt creates the Federal Housing Administration, the first people running that were the realtors. And so the realtors brought all of that, all of those discriminatory practices to the federal government when the Federal Housing Administration was created. So the code of ethics was to separate, not to integrate. And this is what, and these are the things that Nathaniel Colley was arguing against. You know, the fascinating thing about these two cases that we spotlight in the film is that he had sniffed this stuff out in real time. And I know there's a lot out there now about, you know, the wealth gap and, you know, African Americans and other minorities couldn't purchase homes, these suburban homes in the 1950s. And so there's a lot of the color of law, there's other speeches and writings on this now. It's all coming out now. But he was doing this in real time when he did not know how it was going to turn out. That's why the speech at Sac State that he gave in 1960 that served as the soundtrack for that film is so significant, because there's probably not a speech out there that's earlier than that addresses all of these things. And he had that, you can just tell he had the audience at that speech spellbound, because they had never heard anybody talk about this stuff. And so in this next part, we're going to hear more in that speech where he talks about some of these other forms of discrimination, you know, redevelopment and blockbusting and other things. So anyway, the code of ethics for the National Association of Real Estate Boards was unethical, if you will, in this regard.
Okay. And so a last question that just came in was the concept, well, it's kind of a twofold question, or two questions that came in kind of the last minute. One person wanted clarification as to whether the whites only also included or excluded Jews, if you know. And then someone wanted a clarification of what you talked about, steering people to one type of housing or another.
Yes, steering is one of those that's a really subtle thing, but you know when you've been a victim of it. For example, the NAACP and Martin Luther King also did this with people that worked for him, where it's called pairing, where you would send a white staffer to a house that's for sale, or looking for homes, and they would present you, they would say, yes, we have this and this, and then you would send an African-American family and say, oh, I'm sorry, you're 5 minutes too late, you're given the runaround, or you're not shown homes in a certain area versus shown homes in other areas. So we're going to get into some of that in the second part, where there's a house. One of our interview subjects told the story of a house for sale on Bland Park Drive in Sacramento, and this is back in the late 1960s. And he had a real estate license, and so he went and wanted to make an offer on this house, African-American man. And so he knew that there was no pending offer since he was in the industry. He kind of knew how long it had been on the market, and he grew up in the housing projects right there, CV Circle, New Helvetia. And so he went to make an offer on them and was told, I'm sorry, we already have multiple offers. So you're steered away or steered toward certain neighborhoods. And so this is, and this probably, this still goes on today too. And the question regarding Jewish people, I don't know, I don't have that in my research. I didn't look into that.
Okay. Well, so it's almost time for us to wrap up. So I want to thank you very, very much for your presentation. Just fascinating for all of us. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back to, I believe, Michelle or Chris to wrap things up.
Thank you, Chris, for this wonderful presentation and bringing before us information about a man of intellect, humanity, bravery, and diligence in his advocacy against discrimination. In appreciation for what you've done and presented to us today, we are giving you an honorary membership in the Renaissance Society, and in your name, making a donation to the Seth Nelson Student Emergency Grant Fund.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Just to remind everybody that today's presentation was recorded. You can view it in two separate ways: on the Renaissance Society forum channel on YouTube or from the Renaissance website. We hope you will join us again next week, next Friday, when Kimberly Reed Edwards gives a presentation on the brave and magnificent women behind the men of Sacramento's early motorcycle craze. She will chronicle the formative years of cycling and the early exciting days of what is called the greatest sport in the world in our city. We invite you to join us for this fascinating account of motorcycling history in Sacramento.